Hello again. We are your host for the Technology Enabled track. I am Miguel Fernandez from Brussels, Belgium.
I am Ciprian Moga from Bucharest, Romania.
So we both work as transformation advisors. We act sometimes as consultants, sometimes as coaches, helping companies to move to the next level. And today we welcome Roderick Banda, based in Cape Town, South Africa. If I'm not misleading, Roderick, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, I'm in Cape Town, South Africa.
So, what a beautiful city. So, Roderick, I think you're the founding partner of CASE, which is the Knowledge Architecture Systems Engineering Consultancy and Academic Network. I believe you're an IS manager, consultant, enterprise and software architect and engineer, but also lecturer, entrepreneur, researcher, and graphic designer. So you probably have some better words to describe yourself and explain a little bit to the audience what you're doing in real life, because I know also that you have a passion for art and architecture.
Yes, and I have a question about architecture that struck me since I met Roderick. I read that actually you did a thesis or something similar on architecture compared to the architecture of the system. Absolutely amazing. And in our first conversation, I remember talking about the architect of the system and the CEO, like talking about the architect of the building and the building owner. And you drove me to good old time was Antonio Gaudi and his mecena and boss, Guel, who ordered him a lot of beautiful house that we admire right now. How do you see the relationship between the architect and the CEO compared to this beautiful example coming from your life?
Well, that's a good question, because Vitruvius, who wrote the pieces around architecture, defined it, and for engineers. So the first thing I'd like to say is that a lot of things that we talk about as architects are actually engineers. I'll come back to that. But the Vitruvian architect was between the patron and the builder. And so, and the patron wasn't just a customer. He was a believer in whatever the theory of good architecture was, or good design and styles that the architect had. So the CEO is really the visionary. So should be the visionary of the company, and should be considered a patron. So you need to resonate with the CEO. In other words, if you're not if you don't have a good relationship, he doesn't buy into your vision, and he doesn't buy into your understanding of what is good and what is quality, and you're not on the same page with that. Typically, if you were doing art and architecture in the early civilization, you would move on and find another patron for your work. And that's often not that's a luxury, because you work in an organization and you have to connect well with your CIOs and CEOs and C-levels, as well as the business. So you don't really have that choice. But the one thing we can learn from that is that we need resonance with people that we talk to and work on behalf. Whether that's people we collaborate with as engineers and builders, or whether it's the patrons, the ones who actually, and we have to have the same kind of visions as the people that are really our customers and patrons. So I like the word patron rather than customer when we talk about architects, because there's a sense of belief, common belief in what is good and what is quality, and what is architecture. So Vitruvius architecture defined it as three things. It was venustas, utilitas, veritas, firmitas. So firmitas was structure. Utilitas was purpose and function. It had to have a function. It had to have a purpose. And then veritas was that it had to be beautiful. So it had to have an aesthetic quality. Often in systems architecture, we might not think of it as aesthetics, as we think of it as cosmetics, but it really plays a very important role, particularly in the human element of things. And then if we look back actually in terms of where we are now, something that Barry says is very, very important. And that is the fact that out of the Industrial Revolution, why we're here where we're at now, why we struggle with antifragility, is because the fragility that we have now actually comes from the Industrial Revolution and modernism. Modernism is a great thing. At the peak of modernism, which was a philosophy about architecture and beliefs and what is good, it was really about balancing. The advent of machines in the late 1800s, early 1900s caused us as a society to think about how we balance life between man and machine, particularly in Central Europe. So your great designers there were really thinking about how to accept that. The British, other parts of the world, were still very much embracing and trying to go back to the classical state, where art was not an imitation, it wasn't manufactured, it was done by hand, and avoid becoming machines. But the philosophy around modernist architecture, which is great, it created the modern world, but some of the bad things about it, which made it brittle, was that it took away many things that were natural. So, no decorations, no ornamentations, these things of using leaves, staircases and branches were taken away, and it was very geometric, it was very abstract. In fact, a lot of enterprise architects today use a framework. We talk a lot about, we love frameworks. And frameworks actually comes, I had an illustration of a wooden framework done by Durer, who actually used it as a perspective machine. It's a wooden frame with a grid basically, and you can divide up it's a window of a view. So you can paint a painting, look at perspective, analyze that using that grid. And that is really what a framework is. It helps us to deal with complexity by breaking things into parts. And Peter Senge wrote about this in the Fifth Element. And his point was really that we lose sight of the whole. We lose the naturalness. So we're losing a lot of, so when we talk about things like how do we make organizations more human-centric, the reason we don't have that is because we've lost that natural element. So with modernism, with factories, building factories and heavy focus on engineering, the human roles within an organization were almost machine-like. They were roles. There were roles in a factory. So economically, there's people that build chairs versus people that build tables. And so we separated that work. And still today, even in the office environment, we have these roles. And these roles really are fundamentally one of the reasons why we don't have as much of a human environment as we have, and what is brittle. And suddenly, the way we abstract these roles and our organizations are fundamentally oversimplified and doesn't cater enough for what is natural. And this is what architects really need to look at. This is a fundamental problem that we face with today.
Roderick.
Just to point out that I think we already have the answer for the question, how we redesign organization to be more human-centered. It was a question that inherited from previous speakers, but I think with the last part, Roderick start to answer to that. Sorry for interruption, but just want to point out that, yes, no more questions, but we wait for more questions, please.
There's a term that I wanted to introduce. I think we were talking about it, Miguel. I think you like this term of what I said as autonomy of one. And that is, I need to explain that because that's quite key to the way I'm jumping a little bit between what I wanted to say, but the autonomy one is actually important in understanding how we humanize organizations. So we have a governance model, and we'd like to follow that as architects, which is between centralized, federated, and autonomous processes and systems. Those can all coexist. It's just a question of balance. But what we really need to strive for now, and this is what's exposed us with COVID-19, working from home, remoteness, is how brittle our organizations have been because we haven't supported the autonomy of one. And in order to build teams and communities, you can't create those ones as cogs in a machinery. So one of the things that has been a negative byproduct of Agile is that people that aren't, Agile extreme programming was actually adopted by software programmers and software engineers, and it was a practice. And then when it became almost like a monopoly game where it just took the method and then kind of sold it into the business started actually seeing it as a way of actually treating teams as if they were machines. So what's their productivity? And again, that's instead of humanizing, which was the whole point of Agile, which was the human values, respect, communication, feedback, courage. Those are human values and principles. We started looking at the processes. So what the autonomy of one is really about is really enabling people. We have to design systems that really enable people to be more autonomous. And the more our organizations are built with strong autonomy, the stronger the teams will be, and the stronger the units that we create will be. But we can't abstract everything, roles and functions, to the extent where we actually make those autonomous beings powerless. And that's the challenge. In this thing that we call digital transformation, a lot of CIOs are still focusing on a very low level in architecture, or the one level, not all three. In other words, or maybe it's a 1, 2, and 3. But the first basis that we start off with is usually firmitas, which is structure. So we think of transformation as going from infrastructure as on-premise to hosted or cloud-based or enterprise cloud and infrastructure as a service. On top of that, we then overlay and we have this challenge of taking our process-centric thinking to now using discrete services and thinking in a more service-orientated way, which has been great actually. If you're a producer, a collaborator, worker, you're a technical person working, if you've seen the revolution that's happened in terms of services and the way we actually are able to integrate, interop, it's unbelievable. But for the end user, it seems very confusing and disparate. It still hasn't gotten to that level where it's the nustas or aesthetic. It's actually what is beautiful. So the user experience is the next level. So the next level of what we talk about is really going from the physical offices and workplaces to what I call the digital workspaces. In the next few years, we're going to probably see a lot more of a technology focus and revolution in what I call digital workspaces. And digital workspaces is how we start taking the first generation of tools and applications and systems that has been created out of the ubiquity of the internet into more cohesive, more integrated environments that makes it more natural for the way people want to work autonomously. So rather than be restricted, whether that's because of function, security, whatever the reason may be, that we're able to overcome those experiences to make people feel like they're more able and they can use the free will to act in the way that they need to, and that organizations empower them to actually do what they need. And the stronger we get at becoming the autonomy of one, the more human-centric we're going to be under, with and balanced with the way we're using technology today.
If the architects have to give up the current, I would say, mainstream frameworks, the ones that have been proved to be, I would say, sufficiently good enough for doing the job, what do they have to do now to make it work? Because if they want to privilege the autonomy of one, then basically they have to work to address complexity in a different way and with a different mindset with what they do, but also different tools.
Yeah, and I think there is an element of life cycle and processes, because we know that the more natural way is not, Agile talks about Waterfall versus Agile, which is more iterative and incremental. And the reality is, for many organizations, Waterfall is actually natural, because when you have to budget, and when you have to plan, those are phases. So at a certain level, those things need to exist in a natural way. So is centralization of information. That is natural for the way organizations need to operate. But the balance comes in sometimes, especially if you're architecting. I think one of the things that we don't do very well, or we don't understand where we fit, is that where do we fit in this phases of project management and planning and strategy implementation? Where do we fit in the Agile world? And I find it's actually almost outside of those structures or cycles. If those were actual processes, natural processes happening, you almost have to work like a gardener in a natural way. And it's better, I found that action design kind of research methodologies of actually taking one action or one intervention or a set of interventions and then reviewing them and then having that reflection is a more natural way to actually architect something, particularly in things that are actually moving constantly. So you work with your teams, you work on very basic, simple sets of interventions or actions, review them iteratively. And this is what I like about the word resonance, because resonance is a very natural thing. All autonomous life units, things that have life, use resonance a lot. They use the feedback loop. They test their environment, they get feedback, and then they react to it. So they react on what they get as feedback. So I think this is something that we need to really practice as architects, to be able to interact with all these separate environments, all these ecosystems of complexity, not abstract them to a simplification, which we love to do, but deal with complexity in a natural way, to actually try and do more like action design kind of research, is actually go and do an intervention, review it, take the next action. So it gives you the flexibility to change your direction if things aren't correct. The other thing is that automation is really important, but we can't, and that is a facet of modernization and engineering, but we also need to realize that the reality is these things that we call exceptions are the reality of the world. In other words, we're going to be constantly dealing with exceptions because that's what will always happen. And if there's bottlenecks in a system, we can't force the organization to just accept that those are exceptions. I mean, we call them exceptions as if they're bad, but in reality, they aren't exceptions. They're actually teaching us that the system's brittle. This is a facet of antifragility. This is a lesson of antifragility, is that those are things that are testing our systems, they're testing our stresses. Therefore, they're wonderful tools. It's like pain, If we didn't have pain, we would burn ourselves. We would do all sorts of things potentially that would damage our body. So we need to learn the things that we look at as negative as actually indicators of what we can do better. And that's why the resonance and the ability to have these feedback loops and to do interventions and to do things incrementally and iteratively within the realities of different teams, different systems, is a really facet of what we should be doing as architects.
How do we design organization to include the contributions of social scientists and other human-centered researchers? It's a question we received from the attendees.
Well, I think it goes back to the fact that IT and systems and technology and in modernism has grown so much out of the engineering field that we use the word architect in the wrong way. So, it's almost as if, everything is an art and science, and we really lost the art. We even think that if our sons or daughters are going to study art as opposed to an engineering or science degree, their life is a failure. So, what do you do with an arts degree? It's become kind of like a joke. But in reality, this is becoming really important in the way if we think of that Vitruvian architecture and we think of the new stuff, which is not just aesthetic and cosmetic, but it's actually a question of what is good. Okay, so it could be about quality. It doesn't have to be about user interfaces or user experience. It could be about what is good and what is quality. And that is really, really important in terms of being able to look at all the knowledge that we've gained from the socio-economy, psychology, human behavior. Those are really important in terms of defining what is good in the context of the areas that we're working in. Because some people culturally may define what is good very differently. For instance, people don't think that Africa has a knowledge system. Africa has one of the best knowledge systems that's been preserved more than any other culture. Most cultures, you find them in museums as artifacts and objects. In Africa, the storytelling culture has recreated the values from generation to generation. So so appreciating you know, the attributes of very natural ways of working, natural ways of how people see what is good. So a person that believes nature is the defining thing of what is good may not resonate well with geometric straight lines, you know, and abstracts. Versus a person that is very modernist engineering oriented, everything is good if it's symmetrical and it's geometrical. Visually, that is. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry. I'm rambling on. Sorry, I'm finding myself.
No. That's fine. That's fine. That's fine. We have people who are involved in integrating social science into architects. So I think your architecture and organization. I think your answer is very valuable. You answer to the people questions. Some magic potions. I get some inspiration from the interview with Barry. That someone who go back and needs to design an architecture, a viable and anti-fragile one. Any thoughts? Any magic potions to take away?
Sorry, can you rephrase that question?
Any advice? Any solution that somebody that is involved in designing architecture can take away from you after your presentation today?
What's the magic wand to
Yes.
design this
yes.
anti-fragile architecture of the future?
I have to say that you know, I think IT people in general, because we come from an engineering or science background. Before I started getting into software development, which is basically what I do all the time, I program night and day. My sons and I program and write or build or create devices like IoT. We are doers in that sense with our hands and stuff. But I studied actually art and architecture and didn't finish. And I wanted to actually study fine arts and become an artist and an architect and be more creative. And so that's why I did my thesis on building architecture as a reference for architecture-intensive disciplines. And I have a lot of resources on my website, case.co.za, and patterns that I've shared. But I think the more we study, you know, we tend to think that wisdom only happened because we're talking about technology in the last decade, 100 years, and then we forget everything else. A lot of human endeavor is over thousands of years of civilization is well recorded. And we're losing a lot of that. We're repeating the same mistakes because we're not going back to, for instance, the Vitruvian definition of an architect and all those lessons, and lessons through the classical period and lessons of modernism and postmodernism. We're in an era of postmodernism. We need to get, you know, the building architecture is way ahead of that when we think about it. And we think that's all philosophical and that doesn't help us in the day-to-day. That's absolutely wrong. You know, a lot of the things I apply today is because of the fact that I have this knowledge. And it gives me the basic principles in which to be able to make trade-offs and understand what I'm actually doing. Because there's a theoretical understanding, actually, that is a foundation of systems thinking. So if you don't have that, if you don't actually understand anything about abstraction, decomposition, from an art perspective, you're never going to understand it trying to think that you're an engineer or you're an engineer that's being an architect. Because that comes from a balance of art and science. You need both. So I think for a lot of people that are doing architecture work, go back to really pure architecture, not just building architecture, but the beginnings of both architecture and engineering as we know it today. Look at the things we understand about human endeavors, particularly the human aspect of it. And that will help us to actually build systems with people in mind.
We've been talking about the concept of resonance at the beginning, but we exploit it towards the system being adapted to the users, basically. But we also know that people are influenced by technology. How do you see that happening in reality? And is it something you believe to be necessary, or it is just a one-way resonance that we have to deal with?
No, it's both ways. And it's resonance also not just between people, it's resonance with what's happening around us. So being more attuned to what's actually going on. For instance, a lot of consumers today were adopting the first generation of cloud-based products that were very specific services. You know, they got storage, they got email, they got all this, they got messaging and so forth. And we still have these very disparate tools. And that was by design. That's how things organically develop, those simple services. What we need to look at is actually if we're just a small business or an entrepreneur or just a manager of our department, how can we make those things less disparate and more integrated and more natural to the way we work? So we're going to start seeing tools that actually integrate services a lot better over time, and actually going to focus on exactly the humanizing and the process. So the abstracts that we call, I think more platform architecture, because I think the typical abstracts of applications don't apply in a lot of the new technologies that we're seeing. But we're going to see more whole, integrated, cohesive technology because of human demand. Human consumer demand and producing demand is wanting more of the integrated stuff than all these disparate pieces. And I think that's where we're gonna see a lot of resonance in the way we actually develop and adapt.
Thank you very much, Roderick. I think we are almost close to the end. Cyprian, do we have something on the Q&A?
We have a question. Maybe I will try to rephrase it a bit, perhaps. How do we encourage user experience work?
This is a very nice question, actually. How do we encourage user experience work in a world focused on minimum viable product and asking customers, users to adapt? That's wonderful, actually, because currently, for instance, let's just talk about personal information as being one of them. I mean, we're going to be looking at redesigning organizations. I think CEOs are going to really look at that from the things that I've said. We're going to relook at the way we use information and give the power of information to more users. So it's actually going to be a win for a lot of users. And the more empowered users are, that is going to naturally develop, forcing the issue around user experience. And working from a minimal viable product, we can't, I think it's just the start. We need to get away from that term and actually get back to iterative and incremental development, evolving, ongoing, constant development of something, and direct that towards guidance from the user and user experiences.
Okay.
Thank you. I think
It was inspired, and I was going into my imagination, listen to Roderick. He has his gift of keeping us not dreaming, but seeing things before they happen. So we hope that we will bring home his magic wand and all his perspective. Thank you very much, Roderick, for a very inspiring.
Thank you, Roderick.
To have you again.
Thank you.